So it's about time we start. Welcome everyone to today's webinar, After the Storm of the Capitol, How Endangered is Democracy? I welcome all of you, both from the US and Germany. It's great having you here. I'll first give you a little context. On January 6th, protesters in support of US President Donald Trump broke into the Capitol while the House was in session to formally confirm the results of the election, which was won by Trump's opponent, Joe Biden. Protesters claimed that the election was rigged and thus the victory was stolen from Donald Trump by a radical left. Trump and his teams themselves have made this claim repeatedly in the past and have engaged in an intensive public and legal campaign trying to change the outcome of the election. While the members of the Congress fled to safety, the mob rampaged through the building, the offices, breaking windows and stealing whatever they could grab. 5 people died. And the US was shocked to its core that a rioting mob was able to attack the core institution of US democracy. How could this happen, and what does this mean for the US? I'm very happy to welcome Professor Thomas Mockaitis to give us his analysis and insights into the event and its aftermath. Thomas Mockaitis is Professor for History, Refugee and Forced Migration Studies at DePaul University in Chicago, where he teaches, among other themes, war and peace studies, history of insurgency, counterinsurgency, and terrorism. This is the second time Professor Mockaitis joins us in this format. In June 2020, he already gave his perspectives on the militarization of the police violence, and the racial divide in the US. So welcome back, Tom. It's great to have you here with us again. The US is certainly not the only society whose democratic foundations are, to use the military term, under attack. In the last years, we have seen the democratic discourse and even democratic institutions targeted by far-right mobilization in Europe as well. To name Hungary, Great Britain, Poland, Italy, and also Germany. On August 29th last year, during protests against the government's restrictive measures to contain the corona pandemic, several hundred people stormed the stairs of the German parliament, calling ultimately for the overthrow of the government, which in their perspectives is trying to install a dictatorship. The protest also referred to typical far-right narratives and agendas of German right-wing extremists. How are these events in the US now perceived by the German far-right? And what differences and similarities can we observe here? Discussing with Tom from this comparative perspective is Dr. Marc von Boemcken. He is head of research of the Bonn International Center for Conversion, an independent research institute in Bonn. He has done extensive research on security and extremism and currently is leading a project on preventing violent radicalization in the state of North Rhine-Westphalia. Welcome, Marc, and thanks for being here. My name is Maurice Doering, and it's my pleasure to moderate through the next 90 minutes. I am a researcher at the Bonn International Center for Conversion, and I coordinate the inter- and transdisciplinary network connecting research on extremism in North Rhine-Westphalia, which facilitates exchange between researchers, practitioners of radicalization prevention, state administration, and law enforcement agencies on topics of extremism and radicalization. First, Professor Mockaitis will give us his presentation, and afterwards, Marc von Boemcken will give his brief input for discussion. Afterwards, we will open the floor for your questions and comments. You can post them in the F&A section below, and I will then forward them to the speakers. We have audiences from both Germany and the US, and in order to ensure a balance of questions, I would like to ask you to please indicate at the beginning of your question whether you are joining us from the US or Germany, just simply by typing capital US or capital G, so I know where the question is coming from. Please note that we record this event and it will be uploaded on BICC's YouTube channel later on then. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to pass the mic to Tom. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and to the BICC for hosting this event, and to all of those of you who are taking the time to view it. I'm going to share a PowerPoint so that you can kind of see my remarks at the same time I'm elaborating on them. And what I hope to do in the next 20 to 25 minutes or so is to lay out some of the broad themes based on what you have been seeing in the news and my own research on violent extremism, and then to use that as a springboard for both Marc's comments from the German perspective, and then to a broader discussion with the rest of you. So I want to talk briefly about what has happened. Maurice has done a nice, succinct overview of the events and so on. Talk about responsibility, but I think the most pressing issue that all of us are struggling with is, what does all of this mean long-term, not just for the United States, but for Western democracy? Because as Maurice also noted, we are seeing play out here what is sadly becoming something of a worldwide, or at least a Western phenomenon in the democracies, where some of the foundational assumptions seem to be being questioned by those who don't like the way events are unfolding. So I think the events are pretty well understood, although we're getting in the US, at least on a daily basis, new information. Very hard to estimate crowd size, but the rally itself may have attracted 30,000 or more people, maybe as many as 10,000 surrounding the US Capitol building, and at least several hundred actually breached the Capitol, and as again Maurice summarized, did extensive damage, vandalized offices, stole items, and so on. The casualties, numerous injuries in addition to the 5 deaths. Arrests are changing almost by the minute. There's at least 100 now, and they really actually have increased the last day from 200 to 300 open case files, and we can expect more to do. One of the things we can perhaps talk about is the degree to which the brazenness with which the perpetrators were willing to talk about what they did on camera and to actually incriminate themselves. Law enforcement has gotten, I think, something like 15,000 or more tips from people that have helped them to arrest these individuals and charge them for various crimes. Now, the thing to keep in mind is we're already seeing in the United States the emergence of a counter narrative by those who support the president and in some ways approve of what happened. One of the arguments is that, well, this was not a planned event, it was a spontaneous activity. And of course, some of the people clearly were caught up in the excitement of the moment. Those of us who study revolution sometimes talk about almost the fete or carnival environment that settles in as people, really act in ways that they normally would not do. But that shouldn't, or the other counter narrative that Antifa, the anti-fascist movement, had, infiltrated and did this to make the legitimate protesters look bad, which of course is manifestly absurd, but still being circulated. Whatever spontaneity was, there was also considerable planning. More and more evidence is surfacing. Intelligence reports before the event warned of it occurring. Social media activity showed a fairly high degree of planning. There was even fundraising activity. Some of the insurrectionists showed up wearing military garb. You've seen pictures of some of them with zip ties. One had a dozen Molotov cocktails. Some may even have firearms. And there's some evidence that pipe bombs were placed in such a way as to divert law enforcement from where the real assault was taking place. A very disturbing report has surfaced and has to be investigated that the day prior to the attack, that some lawmakers in Congress had actually given some of the participants in the riot tours of the building in which they had a chance to do reconnaissance on its vulnerabilities. And we also saw some of the insurrectionists had equipment that allowed them to scale the walls of the Capitol and get to the second floor balcony, which was another place at which they entered. So this was by no means a purely spontaneous event. There was quite a buildup to it, and there was a lot of evidence of preparation. What were their goals? Well, clearly what they hoped to do was to disrupt the receiving of the Electoral College. I realize our system designed in the 18th century can seem a bit arcane to anyone who isn't in the US and even to us who are. But between the election of a president, there are a number of steps which under normal circumstances are perfunctory. Certification by Congress on the 14th of December, and then the actual delivery of the ballots in a ceremonial fashion on the 6th of January. Normally, these things are hardly even noticed because, the loser concedes. A colleague of mine from the University of Chicago and I were on a talk show and he was saying how the transition between administrations in a lot of countries is a period of tension. In the US, it normally isn't because the loser usually concedes. Even in a hotly contested election in 2000, where Vice President Al Gore had a much stronger argument about fairness in one state, in Florida. Once the court had ruled that there would be no further recount, he not only conceded, he actually presided over the receiving of the ballots that certified that he had lost the election. So but increasingly there was pinning of hopes on these last-ditch efforts, and I was expecting the violence to occur when the last procedural opportunity, which was January 6th, evaporated, and of course that was the case. They really wanted to stop it happening. They were prepared to intimidate lawmakers. They may have been prepared to detain and hold some of them hostages. We had a similar incident in the fall with a militia plan to capture the governor of Michigan, which was fortunately foiled. And it's because of these things that myself and other experts are referring to this as an insurrection. This is an armed effort to disrupt government. Now, whether that holds up to a legal charge and so on, you may be wondering, you're saying people are being arrested, but they're being charged with unlawful entry and things of that nature and destruction of property and whatnot. That seems pretty mild. But what law enforcement is doing is they're arresting them on things that are clearly easily proved. But that does not mean there will not be additional charges. To build a case for insurrection is going to take a lot more time and effort than you can do. But the fact that they can immediately arrest them for clear-cut violations is part of why they're proceeding the way they are. And more charges will be added, both to individuals, and more arrests will be made. Now, the security failure, I fully expected violence on January 6th. I was horrified that security at the US Capitol building was so incredibly lax. Too few police, many of those were deployed, were inadequately equipped without riot shields, tear gas, any of the other things they needed. The National Guard, which by the way, in the Capitol is under the command of the president, unlike the states where it's under the command of the governors, was very slow to deploy. And some evidence that the president was very reluctant even then to let them be called in. And all of that is under investigation. There's a lot that we still don't know. And there's also some evidence that police may have facilitated, either tacitly or overtly, the insurrectionists getting into the Capitol, opening barriers, taking a selfie in one case, one officer wearing a MAGA hat. Nothing wrong with him supporting the president, but not while he's on active duty, and certainly not in this situation. I can tell you that some of the far-right extremist groups, particularly a group called the Oath Keepers, which is a paramilitary militia, have actively recruited veterans, active duty military, police, and first responders. And I think that's one of the major areas we're going to see investigation going on in the days and weeks ahead, because it's a cause for concern when the reliability of those institutions is compromised. The other thing that you may have heard a lot of commentary about that many of us have noted is the stark contrast between the soft response to this violent white mob compared with the much more aggressive militarized response to the Black Lives Matter movement over the summer. In the deep racial divisions of the United States, one writer has observed that almost by definition, when a group of African Americans protest on the streets, they're characterized as rioters and looters. even when they're peaceful. And when a white group is doing the same thing, they're characterized as demonstrators, even when they are being violent. So I think that, if you look at some of the images from the summer where you had, National Guard troops on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, which was pure theater, African American, Black Lives Matter protesters were not about to go deface the statue of Abraham Lincoln. But it just shows you how the contrast here, and it's really been the subject of a lot of discussion. Who is responsible? Many consider that the president was at the very least encouraged and perhaps instigated the violence that took place. He and others are often very careful to walk a thin line between overtly calling for this action, but understanding perfectly well that the more extreme elements in his base will take his remarks as a call to arms. So before the rally, he tweeted, "Be there, will be wild." And that in the speech, he said that we will never give up, we will never concede. If you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country. And then, of course, telling them to walk down the street to the Capitol to make, both their unhappiness and their support, but for those who were not doing what they wanted and the support for those who were clear. Now, he also made the comment that, oh, please be peaceful. Well, any number of extremist groups on their websites will have those kinds of disclaimers. The Proud Boys will have all of this hate-filled rhetoric, but then they'll say, well, we're an equal opportunity group, we don't discriminate based on race, and we reject violence. That, of course, is in part to keep them out of trouble, so they believe, but no one really believes it. So in this case, it's hard to imagine he didn't realize that some people would take it as a call to arms. So, and when the articles of impeachment the House passed, for which they charged him with incitement of insurrection, are based largely on these remarks that I have cited here. Something else is going on. I mean, everyone is making comments. Oh, yes, we know Donald Trump has lied. He's lied for 4 years. He's lied before that, et cetera. But I think that misses the point. It isn't really about discrete acts of not telling the truth. It's about, I think, what Hitler called in Mein Kampf, the big lie. That propaganda is based on the big lie. He said, people don't believe little lies. They don't worry much about little lies because we all tell them. But the big lie, keep it simple, say it often, and people will believe it. That's the real concern here. That reality itself is not a matter of what is objectifiably can be verified, but it's what the leader, who's the embodiment of the will of the people, actually says it is. And that's the disturbing pattern here. Not only does he tweet his own misinformation until they took his account away, but anything that that challenged it was described as fake news. Many people don't realize that even when he was running for president in 2016, when Senator Ted Cruz won the Iowa caucuses, candidate Trump claimed, well, no, he stole the election. He stole that particular case. Same thing, he said after he was elected in 2016, he won the electoral vote, but not the popular vote. But he then said, well, if you take out the illegal votes, I won the popular vote too. Same thing in 2018 with midterm elections in Florida and charges of voter fraud without evidence. And then during the summer, of course, it was interesting, the spring and summer, he was already laying the groundwork for the big lie, for this idea, because he was very clear once Vice President Biden emerged as a front runner, polls were showing the president trailing consistently. And what he began to do is to lay the groundwork for the big lie that unless I win the election, the results by definition are fraudulent. And that becomes an article of faith. I was asked yesterday in a media interview, well, does he really believe this? Well, it's hard to know what's going on in his mind. I think at some level, he probably realizes he lost the election. But there was value in promulgating the lie that he had actually won. But I also sometimes wonder whether in his alternative reality bubble that he may actually himself have come to believe that what he has said is true. And he's continuing to do that despite, as we see, clear certification of results And strikingly, in key places, I'm very grateful that President-elect Biden won Georgia and Arizona, historically deeply red Republican states with Republican governors and secretaries of state. So it becomes really hard to argue that the election was stolen. And the other absurdity is, of course, well, if the Democrats were going to steal the presidential election, why wouldn't they steal the House and Senate races? If you could fake the ballots for one, why would you leave that detail overlooked? But, again, reality is not objectively verifiable. It's what the leader says it is. I think the enablers in some way disturb me more than the president himself. Members of his base get their news from, I think you're familiar with this term, echo chambers, going only to websites and news outlets that already confirm what they already believe. People are migrating away from Fox even to something called Newsmax, which is not being censored in any way or countered. And if that's all you hear, then you don't get an alternative view. It's certainly his Twitter followers accept what he has said, and he's selected advisors and appointed people to government positions based on loyalty to him, not expertise. It was funny at the time when he was arguing in 2016 that the National Park Service had actually altered photographs of his inauguration to make him look bad and make the crowd look smaller. And when that was echoed by his press secretary, an American political commentator on Meet the Press, Chuck Todd, challenged White House advisor Kellyanne Conway that this was simply not true. And she said, well, they're presenting alternative facts, which seemed kind of funny at the time. But again, as we look back on it, it's deadly serious. And it shows what we're dealing with here, that there is not even an agreement on what is reality. Even after the violence, you had 139 representatives and 8 senators challenge state results. Now, many of these individuals, like Senator Josh Hawley, are too intelligent to believe the rhetoric they're presenting. This man is a Stanford undergrad and went to Yale Law School. It's hard to imagine that he or Senator Cruz or others all really believe this, but they find it useful because they know it's his base. 45% of Republican voters surveyed in one poll agreed with or supported. Now, of course, what does that actually mean? The storming of the Capitol. It means maybe 15 to 20, 25% of the total electorate thought this was okay. Doesn't mean the majority do by a long shot, but it's a disturbing statistic nonetheless. Who was actually responsible? A whole list of groups. I tell my students, and also in my writing, make the point that bigots are equal opportunity haters. Anti-government types, racist types are probably also anti-Semitic, anti-LGBTQ, anti-immigrant, Islamophobic, and so on. Proud Boys, you've probably heard a lot about. It's a generic hate group, misogynist, and so on. 3%ers are a bizarre group. These are the most worrisome people to me. There are 80 armed militia groups. And they really consider themselves descendants of those who fought the British in the American Revolutionary War. Only 3% they claim did that, and they figured they're the descendants of that. I talked about Oath Keepers, the Boogaloo movement, so I don't want to read all of these. You're all familiar with neo-Nazis. Another hugely disturbing group is Christian nationalists. These are people, right-wing, conservative, evangelical Christianity, not all, let me be very clear, has embraced Trump, and the Republican Party has embraced them. And some of them have this narrative that the United States is the New Jerusalem, the city on the hill, and that Christianity and patriotism are conflated, and that we are, we are not, we should be a Christian nation. And I'll show you some images in a second. QAnon conspiracy theorists have gotten a lot of attention, and so on, that the deep state is, a ring of pedophiles and Trump is trying to oust them and all that. It's absurd, but they managed to get one member elected to Congress. Unaffiliated supporters, many who identify broadly with the white power movement, but do not belong to any group. And sadly, evidence of off-duty police and former military. I think this graphic, one picture being worth 1,000 words, gives you an idea. Any claim that the president's support base are merely moderates who, have concerns about the nature of society, that's ripped away by these images. You can see the Confederate flag. This is a Revolutionary War symbol. Don't tread on me. It's an anti-government symbol, as is this one. This is a QAnon shirt. Trust the plan. This kind of mystical idea that there's a plan to overthrow this deep state conspiracy. This horrible Camp Auschwitz anti-Semitic shirt with the phrase that was over the gates to Auschwitz in German, Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free. This is a symbol of Christian nationalism, the Crusader cross, people chanting outside the building, Christ is King and whatnot. And the noose here, of course, was probably intended for Mike Pence, but for African Americans, it's an ominous reminder of our ugly history of lynching. And the shirt in the bottom right with the arrow pointing to it is is an abbreviated thing of, 6 million were not enough, an anti-Semitic reference to the Holocaust. Several of these individuals, including this man with the Auschwitz shirt, have been arrested. And many of them, it's really disturbing. At least the one who said, well, I was only doing what my president told me to do. And he's expecting a pardon, which I very much doubt the president will do, because he would be admitting his own wrongdoing. And then, of course, deeply beneath the surface, the MAGA movement, what a Make America Great Again really means. It's not merely a restoration of a position of world power, because there's no indication that that's been compromised. But again, the big lie, make America a white, nominally Christian nation of people who were born in the country as opposed to being immigrants. We don't have a good word for this in English. The German term Volksgemeinschaft, which the Nazis used, the racial community, that only those who are within that defined group really matter. And you've had legislators in a state like Wisconsin saying, well, it's okay if we gerrymander the electoral districts, if we rig them so that the minority party gets more seats than the majority, because if you took out Madison and Milwaukee, the two big cities, we would have the majority, as though the square footage of land that your supporters occupy matters more than population. But in their view of the world, they're the real Wisconsinites, they're the real Americans, and their votes should be the ones that count. The movement's anti-immigrant, Islamophobic, anti-LGBTQ, and committed to traditional gender roles. Now, they're very good at what I call coded racism. They avoid overt statements. They won't say, women need to know their place. They'll say things like, well, society works better when traditional gender roles and the traditional family are upheld. Or we're not racist, we just celebrate our European heritage and express white pride. Beneath the surface, of course, there's no question all of this can be encompassed under the category of the white power movement. And of course, they also are usually anti-Semitic. The continuing threat of violence, groups that participated in the 6th, of course, as we know, have vowed to do it again. I'm relieved we didn't have any incidents this past weekend. There were even threats made against, mainline liberal Christian churches, again, who were a subject of a target. The FBI has said this threat is credible. Governors have had to ramp up security at state capitals, and we have 25 to 30,000 National Guard in or around the United States Capitol. That in itself is a profoundly depressing and disturbing event. That to have an orderly transfer of power, we need to put that much military presence on the ground to protect what should be, and always has been, an orderly transfer of power. We have not had soldiers sort of camped out in the US Capitol building since the American Civil War. That's well over 150 years ago. And sadly, political leaders and media pundits are continuing to empower and legitimize the violence. They're very careful. Oh yes, violence is always wrong, pause. However, and then the bulk of their commentary is an explanation of why they understand people's behavior and expect, and see it to some degree as legitimate. Again, walking the tightrope, avoiding over incitement, but clearly expressing sympathy. So are we in a crisis of democracy? To kind of to wrap up my remarks here, democracy needs a consensus, whether just Germany, the United States, Hungary, Britain, any country in the world requires a consensus, not about policy or about about plans or anything like that, but about the process itself. That elections have integrity and legitimacy. And even appointees of the Trump administration, including judges who are quite conservative that he appointed, have certified that that's the case. But if you really challenge that core premise, and you really state that any election that your candidates do not win is by definition illegitimate, either because it must be stolen because you believe that you have a majority no matter what the objective vote total shows, or because you believe that the right vote, the votes of the people who should be counted are the only ones that matter, we're going to be a democracy in crisis, and it's going to take a long time to heal. And I fear that we will be seeing sporadic violence in the weeks, months, and maybe even years to come. And with that, I will pause and turn it over to Marc for his comments. Thank you.
Okay, Maurice, will I continue?
Yes, thank you, Tom, for your presentation and quite disturbing details and grim outlook. Before we continue with Marc, I would like to remind the audience you can already post questions in the F&A section. Please do so. We can already collect them, and I can go back to them then later in the discussion. Marc, please.
Okay, thanks, Maurice, for the introduction, and thank you, Thomas, for that very interesting, also, I guess, quite unsettling presentation. Now, I was asked to comment on your remarks and also compare the situation in the US to that in Germany. And maybe let me begin by pointing out, you draw a very bleak and sort of pessimistic picture. And as you argue, the assault on the Capitol building, was not a spontaneous or isolated event, of a few radicals, but must really be understood, as a symptom of a larger development that seriously has the potential to seriously endanger the democratic consensus in the United States. Now, I guess I don't want to contest, that reading as worrisome as it certainly is. However, maybe one thought is that I do feel that the incident on the 6th of January, and particularly maybe also the reception of that event, can be interpreted in, let's say, a more positive, a more optimistic manner. That is to say, my feeling is that it possibly also was a wake-up call, certainly for some members of the Republican Party, but quite possibly also for a great many Trump supporters. Basically the feeling that this has somehow gone too far, that this has spiraled out of control. And in other words, my guess is that 75 million Americans that voted for Trump, those 75 million, not all of them support the assault on the Capitol, but many people, that once supported Trump now take this incident, as an occasion to turn their backs on him. Indeed, and especially since Trump has also been banned from social media, he was arguably never as isolated as he is now. So maybe, and with some hindsight, the assault on the Capitol building might have strengthened rather than weakened the democratic consensus in the United States. And this is not to say that the incident has not, further radicalized a few people. And indeed, I do expect that that we will see, more violence in the future, and quite possibly also further, terrorist attacks from the far right. And this has to be taken seriously, no doubt. But my hope is that these actions will not be supported by a large popular movement that has the power to seriously threaten the political system in the United States. And I would be interested in, in your thoughts on this thesis. Now, as I said, I was asked to compare the events in the US to what we're seeing in Germany. And I'm not sure if this was much covered in the US media. Probably it wasn't. And Maurice, you mentioned this at the beginning of this event. In August last year, we had an incident quite similar to the assault on the Capitol building here in Germany, although I must add on a much smaller scale. And let me, if this works, maybe show you a picture. Here we go. So now what we can see here, are a group of demonstrators waving the so-called Reichsflagge, that is, the German colors of the German flag up to the end of the First World War, and later also used by the Nazis. And nowadays, this is clearly a symbol of right-wing extremist groups, far-right groups in Germany. We can see them standing on the staircase of the Reichstag, a building that today serves as the German parliament. Unlike in Washington, D.C., the demonstrators did not manage to enter that building. However, given the history of Germany and the history of the Reichstag's building in particular, these are sort of disturbing images that caused a great deal of concern amongst many Germans at the time. So I guess the question is valid. To what extent are developments within protest movements in Germany similar to what is happening in the US? Now, to answer this question, I think it's quite helpful to put the image that I just showed you into its context. It was taken during a demonstration in Berlin, which protested against the restrictions that the German government has put into place to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. Around 38,000 people participated, so I guess that's even actually slightly more than those people that rallied around the Capitol building. And although this is quite a large number, I think a very important observation is that the only common denominator of all these people protesting was, I would say, a certain unease with what they felt is too much government interventions into their lives, and possibly also a more general skepticism towards state institutions, political elites, not least science. So apart from these similarities, the protesters joining such demonstrations, and by the way, there have been several such demonstrations over the past year in many German cities. So apart from these similarities, they are sort of a very diverse and heterogeneous group of people. So there is no real common ideology that binds them all together. Certainly we have some far right and even extremists, so far right extremists, who seek to capitalize on the anti-corona protest, especially as migration is not as much a public issue anymore as it was a couple of years ago. But there are also conspiracy theorists who would consider themselves more on the political left. In fact, interestingly, while some of the protesters may well harbor, some sympathies for fascism, National Socialism, as obviously the Reichsflag indicate, and they protest against the government that they consider to be too liberal or too democratic or whatever. For many other protesters, it is precisely the other way around. So they draw a parallel between current corona restrictions and restrictions imposed by Hitler on political freedom in the early 1930s. So from their point of view, they see themselves in a direct tradition of German resistance groups against the Nazis, against fascism. That's a theme that can be observed, during many of these demonstrations. So what we have then, all in all, really is, not only some very strange political thoughts and some very disturbing historical parallels that are drawn here, but also very strange and puzzling alliances that are emerging between very different, I would argue, very different segments of society. And I think this is still not fully understood, and there is still a need for some research, empirical research, what is really happening here. Now, and please correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm by no means I'm an expert on the protest movement in the US, but my impression is that the people that rallied and protest in Washington, DC are by comparison more homogeneous. And I guess it also ties in with what you just said in your presentation, Thomas. Or at least they were quite homogeneous up until 6th of January. Now we might be seeing a fragmentation of that movement. And in comparison to Germany, again, I guess the reason for that comparative homogeneity is on the one hand, of course, that they have a political figure that they can rally around and that sort of ties them together. And thankfully, we have no politician comparable to Trump in Germany, in that sense, yet. Now, we do have a right-wing populist party, the AfD, that is trying to bandwagon on the new protest movements. And in the past, this party has indeed been quite successful in federal and state elections over the past years, mainly on the ticket of advocating anti-migration policies. However, my feeling is, and also based on some voting surveys that were done, that the AfD could not really capitalize on siding with the anti-corona protests. And we will see how this works out, whether this is true during a number of elections this year, and particularly the upcoming federal election in Germany. I think another difference between Germany and the US is that, and you also mentioned this, Thomas, is that the political culture in the US is a different one, with a long history of widespread skepticism and distrust among large segments of the population against state institutions, reflected, for example, in debates surrounding gun ownership. That's something we do not have in Germany in that form. By contrast, I think, looking at the German populace as a whole, the number of people protesting against corona restrictions, the conspiracy theorists, the right-wing extremists, those people, that number is not that large. I would say it's a minority, although it's a very vocal minority. And as disturbing as the events undoubtedly are, we should not present the problem as bigger than it actually is. So all in all, I guess one could argue that while on the surface, new protest movements in the US and Germany share many similarities, and in conspiracy theories like QAnon have an international global reach that sort of can also be encountered in Germany. It's also picked up in Germany, of course, but these movements manifest themselves and play out differently in different national contexts and different political cultures. Finally, then, let me emphasize what I do not see, an immediate threat to democracy, neither in the US or neither in Germany nor the US for that matter. This should not mean that we should not take these developments serious in both countries. I do expect that we will continue to see violence and more violent attacks. And any such incident, we know this as conflict researchers, has a potential for dangerous escalation. Now this escalation has thankfully not happened in the aftermath of January the 6th, I guess, but it might well still happen in the future, so we have to be cautious. And one particularly important point, which you also raised, Thomas, and this is really my final point now, to my mind, the most dangerous and maybe also worrisome observation, which has become very clear over the past year, is that there seems to be a comparatively large percentage of racists and people sympathizing with right-wing extremism in the public security sector, sort of the military, but particularly the police. And this is not only the case in the United States, but it would seem also in Germany, as quite a number of media reports over the last years suggest, where we sort of right-wing, extremist, racist chat groups within the police have been uncovered, particularly actually in the state of North Rhine-Westphalia, where I live. And although this is not necessarily a new phenomenon, and also, by no means every police officer is a racist, far from it, it's a minority, there is, to my mind, still an urgent need to address this problem in the near future, also here in Germany. I leave my remarks with that. Thank you very much. Back to you, Maurice.
Thank you, Marc, and thank you for the dose of optimism, which we definitely need in the U.S. Enmeshed in this stuff, it's easy to get discouraged. But I think you're absolutely right. This was a wake-up call, and I think those of us have said, many of us have said, we've taken our democracy for granted. It's fragile, and we need to work at it. But I think we can take great pride at having a secure election under extraordinarily difficult circumstances of a pandemic and everything else. And that was due to thousands of, honest Republican and Democrat election officials, volunteer election judges, poll watchers, etc., to make sure every vote could be cast and every vote could be counted. And I think we can take great encouragement. And I think those who will be violent are a very, very small subset of the population. It's just they happen to be well armed and well organized. Still, the concern that 75% of Republicans, they don't approve the violence, but they think the election was fraudulent, is worrisome, and we have work to do. As far as we've also had open up rallies in the US, the difference has been is where your government has asserted for valid public health reasons that certain precautions need to be taken. Our government, our president has politicized wearing masks and opening up. And when he tweets, open up Michigan, open up Maryland, again, it was a call to arms. And so you're right, we've seen a more homogenous overlap with the far right extremism in the open up movement. Yes, if you saw the pictures, overwhelmingly white, disproportionately young, disproportionately male, well, not exclusively. And I could go on and on with the demographics, but yes, I think that's a valid distinction between the two. So I guess we're ready for questions now, Maurice.
Yes, thank you, both of you, also for your immediate reply to Marc. So we have the first question that came in. I'm going to read it to you. It's to Thomas. What is your view with respect to the evangelical movement or establishment as a whole? My impression is that even critical media such as CNN are extremely careful not to touch the establishment's essential and massive role in launching the Trump presidency, and even in enabling Trumpism in exchange to certain politico-ideological beliefs. Pence and Pompeo, among others, seem to have been wardens of this mutual business. In my view, the social and political impact of white extreme authoritarianism will prevail if the non-parliamentary power of the evangelical movement is not questioned.
I think it's an excellent question. And it actually predates Donald Trump. In the late 1990s, Karl Rove, who was the chair of the Republican Party, made a calculated decision to move the focus of the Republican base away from things like small government, free enterprise, things of that nature, which reasonable people could discuss and disagree with, to embrace conservative Christianity, the evangelical right. And that proved very successful as an electoral thing, but we're now seeing the price of that. I want to be clear that not all evangelicals, there's an evangelical left. Evangelical refers to beliefs about Christianity. They're not all politically conservative, but a large number are. And they literally feed into this rhetoric because, and their churches have been used, to promote this, and very high profile individuals, most notably Franklin Graham, using the wealth and influence of his movement to advocate for the president, which is contrary to our separation of church and state. And you're right, I think there's a tentativeness among the media perhaps to take that on, but I think there's growing effort. I consider myself what we call a progressive Christian, someone who holds my faith dearly, but doesn't believe it's a judgment on everybody else and doesn't take an exclusive position, that it's the only way. And we're talking more and more about how in our churches, we need to stop surrendering the moral high ground of Christianity to these groups who want to turn it into an instrument of hate and exclusion. But the questioner is absolutely right. That is the Christian nationalism is going to get more attention, and it is a very pernicious phenomenon we have to address.
By the way, I mean, just to add, we also have evangelical movements in Germany joining in the anti-corona protests. And they also play a role, in that context over here, as well, by far not, as important as in the United States.
I'm going to take up two questions from our US audience. The first one is again to you, Thomas, and the second one is to you, Marc. So the first one to Thomas: any insights on the demographic characteristics of the extremists beyond race, age, income, education level? And then to Marc: I saw in the picture of the protest in Berlin that at least one of the protesters was holding an American flag. Does the German right look to the American right for inspiration?
Okay, in terms of the question addressed to me, yes, there has been some very good research on the demographics of what they call the alt-right, which is sort of the umbrella under which these groups could in fact be included. We know about their racial makeup. They don't congregate by age. They in fact tend to be, they're not university educated. They tend to be working class. They're disproportionately rural. They're people who arguably have, to some degree, been left behind as the economy is transformed into a high-tech, service-based, information-based thing requiring specific skills and education. There is evidence that women an equal number of women hold these extreme views. They just are less likely to act on them in the manner they do. And of course, given that some of the neo-Nazi and Proud Boy and other movements are actually hostile to them, that's not hard to understand. Interestingly enough, I did some research. I'm trained as a British historian. If you look at the profile of the Brexit voters in Britain, they have almost many of them, the exact same profile. So again, we're seeing a Western, broader phenomenon in the US. But it's a diverse group, and some of the leaders are very highly educated. As I said, I mentioned Hawley being a graduate of Yale Law School and so on. But yeah, there is a distinct demographic, and there are higher concentrations in regions and areas and in rural rather than urban.
Yeah. So regarding the second question, thank you very much for that question. Maybe first of all, as I said, I mean, the German protest movement is very heterogeneous. So in a sense, there is not the response or the perception of events going on in the United States. One would have to differentiate between different segments. But I think, as you ask, I mean, if we look at the far right in Germany, and those people that also consider themselves as part of the far right, they do see a certain role model in Trump. I mean, in a sense, what they're hoping for is to repeat what has been happened in America here in Germany, to have sort of a similar development. And what we've been seeing, at least what I've been sort of reading regarding reactions of the far right in the aftermath of the 6th of January, is disappointment. Actual disappointment that this has not gone far enough, that this was not precisely not what they had actually hoped for, a successful revolution, and that's what they hoped for, that this would go much further, and it didn't happen. So we do see this disappointment here, and now I also sort of have read some tweets that Trump is now a traitor, because he has abandoned his soldiers, his militias. So we do see those reactions, and we do see sort of great sympathy in parts of the German right for Trump, particularly that movement, that right-wing movement in the US, but others, others are very sympathetic of Putin and the Russians. So it's not an easy answer, not a straightforward answer.
Thank you. I mean, maybe just to add what we can also see in the far right extremist movement, that it somehow is globalizing. So we see these transnational developments. We observed this with the attacks in Christchurch, but also in Germany and Halle, where the perpetrators did like reference the international community of the right-wing movement. So of course there's some knowledge exchange, there's some how are they doing in other countries, and there's a lot more exchange and learning from each other. So and this also goes for the QAnon movement, which curiously enough also is here to be found in Germany. Although it is a quite American narrative, it still finds supporters here. And there's the question, so Peter Neumann recently stated that the QAnon movement will be the largest terrorist threat in the upcoming years. Thomas, would you agree with this statement?
I'm not sure how, I don't know that it can be, these things are, there's so much cross-pollination, there's so much overlap that it's hard for me to sort that out. QAnon right now is not, is considered to be fringe. But on the other hand, whether they're formal members or not, many militia members and many of the other hate group and extremist members do harbor conspiracy theories to one degree or another. In fact, all of the discussion of voter fraud is a giant conspiracy theory in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary, and even in the face of common sense. So I think, yeah, it could very well be that that is the case. If you are in an information bubble and in an alternate reality bubble, you can persuade yourself that anything is permissible. And I think that's the hardest thing. When I started working on terrorism, oh my gosh, 30 years ago, we were talking about breaking up groups, disrupting financing, arresting members of networks. Now we're much more focused on countering radicalization and ideology, which is a lot harder to do. How do you break in and essentially persuade people that their ideology is profoundly flawed?
Maybe also just with regard to the QAnon movement. Now, the way I understand it, this is not really a movement in the sense that it has an organizational structure, with someone at the top and different units. So what is QAnon? QAnon is first and foremost an ideology that everyone can read about in the internet, and then you can pick bits and pieces that suit your own belief, maybe strengthen certain your own beliefs that you have. And my argument is, whereas, as I also just said in my presentation, whereas QAnon sort of has a global reach and can be picked up anywhere, it will play out differently depending on local or national or local conflict factors, and so I would sort of rather I would not take QAnon sort of too seriously, but rather look at the way that QAnon sort of is interpreted in certain contexts or conflict contexts.
Yeah, the thing I would add too is that once we get out of the danger zone of the inauguration and so on, the violence we've seen over the past several years has been perpetrated, by what we sometimes call lone wolves, except that the lone wolves are fellow travelers of the ideological movement. The man, Brent Tarrant, the man who committed the massacres at the mosques in Christchurch, as Maurice alluded to, he quoted Anders Breivik from Norway, who carried out the horrible attacks there. And he referred to Dylan Roof, a man who murdered people in an African-American church in Charleston, South Carolina. But he was not a formal member of any group. So in many cases, it's the hangers-on and the fellow travelers, because you can't as easily track them, who will perpetrate some of the worst events. And because of the easy access to firearms in the US, it's not hard to do.
Thank you. So we have quite a few questions coming in here. So One from Germany again. The events in the US very much remind me of events seen in developing countries ruled by authoritarian regimes whose overarching priority is to remain in power. How can future US governments convincingly argue in favor of democratic procedures and peaceful transition of power in developing countries? Do the events in the US play very much and for a very long time in favor of autocrats in developing countries? Or do you see a way how the new US government could successfully become, again, a trusted promoter of democracy in other countries?
Yeah, there's no question our moral credibility is severely compromised. It's difficult for us to go and argue in the case of Uganda that the election really may have been stolen through voter suppression when we ourselves are saying you're having to fight off an illegitimate charge in the same way. And the president of Turkey sent a rather ironic message mimicking our language when we warned Americans not to go to his country following the attempted coup a couple of years ago. So there's no question we're in that thing. But to return to Mark's excellent point, it didn't work. What we can celebrate is, look, we did not allow this to happen. Yes, we had a demagogue for whom remaining in power was the overwhelming and only consideration, but his efforts failed, and they failed in part because members of his own party refused to go along, and the voters themselves refused to go along. So I think we can recover it, but I think it's a sobering lesson that, as I said, we take for granted that our democracy will inherently always be strong, and we don't have to work at keeping it. So yeah, we've got work to do, but I am optimistic that we will come out of this ahead.
I have another question from Germany. I also like to encourage our US audience for more questions. Please go ahead. And the next question also ties a little bit into the international realm. So Trump's relationship towards Russia and Putin has been quite unusual. Have his attitude shared within the ranks of his followers, and how will the positive view of Putin and of Russia play a role in Republican policies after Trump?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the most bizarre things in the world, because the base were the ones who, in a sense, communism for, half a century was the boogeyman, the evil specter that was hidden behind everything and so on. And they did a complete 180 when the president came into office. And so, again, because of his rhetoric, there's been very little criticism in those circles of what was clearly a Russian hacking attack on the United States, whose damage was quite extensive. And now even some claims that they pumped some money into this movement. So I don't know, I don't think that particular piece of the ideological puzzle will have a lot of legs, because I think it will not be that hard to remind people of the adversarial nature of Russia towards the United States. But I think the more serious concern is, for the last 4 years, the United States has arguably withdrawn from international affairs to a dangerous degree, most noticeably, I think, in Europe, with a very anti-NATO attitude on the part of the president, and and things of that nature. And rebuilding that trust and confidence is going to be one of the major ways of countering the threat that Putin poses.
We have another question from the US to Marc. Were those who were in Berlin in August demonstrating solidly around the objection to COVID precautions put in place by the government? And to go off of that, what other causes or viewpoints connect these demonstrators to each other?
Well, maybe Maurice, maybe you can correct me if I see it wrong, but my impression is that, as I said, the common denominator was indeed, and the occasion and the common denominator were the government restrictions imposed on COVID-19, on the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, what we can see, we can discern sort of a lot of other agendas, that became attached to that, and they all have in common a certain unease and sometimes even outright rejection, of the state. I mean, the so-called, I have no idea how to translate this into English, the Reichsbürger movement, which is basically people that think that Germany as a state does not exist, that Germany is still occupied by the Allied forces following the Second World War, and that the peace treaty, there was never a peace treaty, so Germany is in fact a private company. So we have those that protest and those movements. We have people that are very, very skeptical towards vaccinations and come sort of more from sort of maybe even sort of the green movement and sort of more spiritual, esoteric movements, which sort of naturally have a large skepticism, but maybe not so much a skepticism of the state, but more of medical science in particular. We have the usual far right, fascists and Nazi parties. I would guess, that we even have sort of normal people that are just, worried about the situation that we have with the global pandemic going on, and worried about all these restrictions that are possibly imposed, and just want to give their concern a voice, and that are not extremists in any sense, although those probably did not include those people that stormed the staircase of the Reichstag, which seem to have been predominantly people from the far right. So I guess, what I'm doing is I'm just sort of reiterating my point that there are many, many agendas that are coming together here from the political right, but also from the political left. And as I also said, some apparently some very strange alliances that seem puzzling on first sight. And frankly, we need to have a closer look and do some research and actually try to understand what is going on here at the moment. And I think the important point here for this discussion is that we do not see, at least I would argue, we do not see the kind of homogeneity that we see in the United States.
If I maybe add to that, since you invited me to exceed my role as a moderator.
Maurice also works on our radicalization project, by the way.
Yeah.
Qualified to speak.
Obviously, on the first glance, it really seems to be some weird alliances we saw in the protests. But on the one note, there are some legitimate concerns. Not all of the protests against the government's restrictions are like on the extremist side. There are a lot of protests that took place were from certain professions or people who were really affected by the restrictions. For example, from the hotel businesses, and they simply demanded a clearer policy and just that they get some support from the government. So not everyone is like on this extremist side of the whole discourse. And on the second note, and if we look closer into the different groups, we were quite surprised to see that there are some alignments on the second glance. For example, if you take those more spiritual alternative medicines or what the so-called healers or people or movements, activists that are very close to nature. So there are some linkages to the right-wing agenda and the right-wing ideologies, like the whole völkische race idea, being connected with the nature and being one in the spiritual sense. So on the second look, there are some hidden linkages that didn't seem so obvious at first. And as Marc said, we really need to do some research on where these ideas actually are in the background and how they flow back and forth between the different groups. That's a quite interesting topic we need to do. We really need to know more about this. And well, questions are coming in. I hope we can manage to answer them all. Let's go back maybe to the US scene from two questions from Germany. are really 25,000 highly armed soldiers necessary in Washington to secure the inauguration? Or is that reaction not more a kind of typical overblown US military response to real, but only by a small part of people organized and supported violent threats? And the second question is, democracy needs respect of integrity of elections. Thomas, you said, but isn't the electoral system in the US so undemocratic that it has to be changed? So changes of an undemocratic electoral system, not respect for the integrity of the current electoral system is necessary.
Yeah. And first to the over response, I mean, I can understand that, and it may prove to be the case that it is more than we need. On the other hand, we went from one ridiculous extreme to another, too little and to a great deal. On the other hand, I can tell you, when you're trying to do static defense against a threat that is pervasive and diffuse, you need many more people than you would if you were aggressively going after them, if that makes any sense. So my concern is not that they'll get to the Capitol, it's too well defended, but we have this thing called target displacement, which means they'll attack whatever's available. The same thing will happen in the States. So yeah, I mean, and we can't sustain this level of security. The costs and everything else are too great. But I think people are erring on the side of caution given what happened on January 6th. You know, in terms of the Electoral College, I mean, this is an artifact from the 18th century, but the framers of the Constitution were very careful to make it very hard to amend the document. And when you realize that 2 of the last 5 elections were won by Republicans with a minority of the vote, why would they seek to change a system that works to their advantage? And many of us have said that. Now, to be fair, when you realize the US is by population and almost physical size, about the same as Western Europe, that what has held us together, perhaps, is an understanding that people say, well, if I don't get my way on the national stage, I at least have some local control. And the argument for the Electoral College has been, well, you know, it requires a candidate to at least try to build a national coalition. I'm less and less persuaded by that in the age of the media, because you know, people say, well, oh, if I'm a Democrat or a Republican in New York, my vote doesn't count. And you could say, well, if I'm a Democrat in Texas, my vote doesn't count in the presidential election. I would argue for vast swathes of the far West, the Dakotas, Nebraska, you know, and so on, your vote doesn't count at all. Presidential candidates never go there because there are so few electoral votes, they don't bother. So I think there is time to do it. I don't think that's going to happen. What probably will happen is a tightening up of moving from the election to the inauguration. So these points of meddling are shut down so that you can't do the kind of protest that happened where 139 representatives and 8 senators can say, I object based on no information, I want to throw out these ballots. I think those things are much more fixable. The other thing is the Constitution gives enormous power to the states to determine voting procedures and rights. So I don't see it being overturned. I see the process being tightened up and improved. And I would like to see it gone. I agree with the questioner, but I just realistically don't think that's very likely.
Another question to Thomas. Do you believe that the majority of the Republican Party will attempt to distance themselves from Trump after the inauguration of Biden? Or do you see a possible fracture occurring within the Republican Party of those still in support of Trump, those more further to the right, and those who play a more centrist role, such as Mitt Romney? Let me just, we had a second question that went into that same direction, so you can maybe put them together. The group storming the Capitol claimed to represent the real identity of America. Biden judged them as, this is not American. What is your recommendation in view of this identity politics dynamics, how to deal with both sides, exclusive identity definitions in order to avoid further polarization? Or do you see this as a case of a tolerance paradox, as Jaspers coined the term?
I think in terms of the Republican Party, the split is extremely likely. The traction the president will have will depend to a large degree, for example, in how impeachment plays out. There are many Republican electors, they say they tend to vote with him, but they hope they lose because they would like nothing better than for him to go away. So they could reclaim the party. They are very afraid of his vote. In terms of the identity politics, that's exactly a large part of it. But I think what President-elect Biden was saying, that the behavior was un-American. I don't think he was questioning the bona fides of the individuals being Americans, but I think they do. I think they have a very exclusionary view that quote unquote real Americans are white, at least nominally Christian, born in the United States, etc. And the real reality, how does the healing go? I think they also know they're on the losing side of history. You could seal the if you could seal the American borders today and allow no further immigrants, by the middle of this century, we would still have no majority population. Euro-Americans, which is a term that didn't exist when I was growing up, would be a plurality of maybe 40%. But we are becoming much more of a rainbow nation. They don't like that, but they also can't stop it. The reality is that we are a diverse population. And the thing that's very strange too is that, my understanding is this plays out, maybe Mark, you could comment in Germany as well, that the areas in which there is the strongest right-wing racist activity are precisely those areas in which they have very little actual diversity that they encounter on a day-to-day basis. You know, in terms of, I mean, small towns in rural America banning Sharia law, having never met a Muslim and with no real understanding of what that term even means, never mind that that's never going to happen. So it's a visceral kind of fear. Same thing happened in the 1930s. The most strongly anti-Semitic areas under the Third Reich were areas in which people had little or no contact with Jewish people because they were, and it was easier to believe the rhetoric. So I think the healing is that, I think I see it every day. I see it every day on my college campus. I see the interactions of young people who are an incredibly diverse lot, and in many ways are far more tolerant than my generation ever was of diversity in all kinds of ways. So I think that the healing is going to take time and again work, but I think it's an inevitable long-term process.
Mark, any remarks from the German perspectives on that?
Yeah, okay. I think in general, it's generally correct that let me put it this way. In areas, there are sort of many areas where there is hardly any diversity, especially in Eastern Germany. We do have sort of a very large percentage of far right people from the far right. That's true, but I would be careful to make sort of an direct, always valid causal points out of this, saying the more diversity, the less we have right-wing extremist views, because in Western Germany, for example, we also have some areas where diversity is comparatively large, but we still have a strong presence of right-wing groups. So this is not an iron law in a sense, but generally speaking, it's correct, especially if we look at Eastern Germany, where diversity is a lot less than in Western Germany.
That perfectly brings us to the next question, which it goes to both of you, but I would like to ask Marc to answer first and then go to Thomas. And it also reminds a little bit our last session together, Thomas. What is your assessment of education as a tool to counter extremism? What are the deficits? What, in this respect, are the similarities and the differences between Germany and the US?
Do you want me to ask?
Yes, please.
Okay. Now, no, I can't say much about the education system in the US. So Thomas can. Maybe you can sort of then, after me, Thomas, say a few words about that, and then we can see whether what the differences and similarities actually are. Regarding Germany, now, Maurice, I guess you would also like to answer this question, because Maurice and myself actually did some research in German schools on prevention of radicalization and how this is reflected in teaching curricula and especially in schools in North Rhine-Westphalia. And one of our findings was, of course, I mean, that political education, I think it goes without saying almost, is an essential part of preventing violent extremism, radicalization processes. But the problem that we encountered in many schools was that sort of a certain needs of pupils to discuss ongoing political events. Maybe, and there is very often amongst pupils, there is a need to reflect on these events, to discuss them, to form an opinion, and sort of this reflection space of current ongoing politics is not really happening in most schools, because the teaching plan is too tough. I mean, teachers are overburdened. There are exceptions, of course, teachers doing working over hours to have these discussions with their students, some excellent examples, people we talk to. But in general, it's not happening, and that's a problem. So I guess one of the recommendations that one can make is that current politics needs to be given a larger space in political education, but also in general in schools here in Germany. That's not happening enough. On the other hand, I would be very careful with using sort of the word prevention and saying, well, the reason that we're doing political education with you is to prevent radicalization, is to prevent you becoming, a potential terrorist, because that always has the effect of stigmatization, of saying why, especially in schools, especially if you start, such prevention projects against radicalization in schools with a large percentage of Muslim pupils, that really carries the risk of stigmatization and self-fulfilling prophecies. Maurice, again, I'll give you the opportunity to add anything.
Since the time is running out, I would like, I think I'm completely satisfied with your answer, so I have nothing to add, of course. And forward the same question to Thomas.
Yeah, in the United States, it's extremely difficult to generalize about education, which is locally controlled. But I can tell you there are two things. One, there is a contesting of the teaching of history. You may have heard of something called the 1619 Project, which is an effort among many African American and other scholars to ask the country to engage the ugly history of slavery and racism in the US. And there has been a pushback. Tom Cotton, the senator from Arkansas, wants to outlaw or ban federal funding to any school that teaches that particular version of history. Texas has talked about not calling it the slave trade, calling it the triangular trade, which in one sense is accurate, and another is an effort to downplay how horrible it was. So it's very uneven American education. And you have to add to that the fact that people who embrace conspiracy theories might be on the far right, are evangelical, radical evangelical Christians, are also much more likely to homeschool their children, which is a real problem we have in the US, where we allow that. And that often what they homeschool them and they get away with it for quote unquote religious reasons. And what they give them is a very rarefied celebratory version of our history and our past. Where schools can play a huge role, we talk about countering radicalization, is not so much in presenting a narrative, but frequently teachers, guidance counselors, and even other students can spot warning signs. In most cases, there are warning signs when a person is moving merely from embracing the ideas to preparing to be violent. And I think a lot of good work can be done trying to educate people to identify and intervene, much the way we train them now to intervene when there's signs of alcohol or drug abuse, to stop some of the behaviors. But American education is just so broad, so diverse, and so complicated, it's very hard to draw conclusions.
If we extend that question on prevention, we talked in both contexts about unsatisfied people, like drawn to these movements. How can this be addressed with an improvement of social politics, Thomas, in the US? Is that a way?
Yeah. There's no question that we have I mean, for example, no party really has, the Democrats stepped away from working class people, to a significant degree in the 80s and 90s. And there's no question that anytime you have significantly alienated and separated groups, that something needs to be done to do that. I mean, I think our education system at my level, at the post-secondary level, is undergoing and needs to go through some serious change. We don't put nearly enough emphasis on providing training for good quality jobs. Most of our colleges are academically based. I'm an admirer of your system. I don't know if it worked, where you can distinguish between Hauptschule, Realschule, and Gymnasium. We don't really have that. And in many areas, there's insufficient respect for skilled trades. Now, this wouldn't solve everything, but if you could do something to address economic inequality, then that would be a step in the right direction. It won't solve everything, because ironically, some of the people most exploited by the corporate interests that are entrenched in the Republican Party have been swayed to vote for Trump based on the identity politics. So they're extremely good at a kind of policy of divide and conquer. But yeah, I mean, we have an economy that is in great unevenness, and we don't have your social safety net. That's a huge thing. I don't think we're going to go for, I mean, the socialism thing is a scare tactic, but we're getting to a point where healthcare, is becoming seen as a basic right. Certain benefits which you have need to be seen as a basic right. And that doesn't mean, we're taking away everybody's private property. Something what we used to call the common good is very, very undeveloped in the US. I see more signs of it in Europe. If you park in a handicapped person's spot in Germany or the Netherlands, I've seen this, people will, even if you do it by accident, they will correct you. They don't wait for the police. Somebody will confront you about that behavior. In the US, it's more likely to get, you can't tell me what to do kind of response. So again, a complicated problem, but definitely something that needs to be done.
It's a quite complex issue, as you pointed out. Many of the things you mentioned, like healthcare system, education system, we have in Germany put politics in place that might qualify as a sort of safety net that you don't have in the US, but still we have extremists, we have radicalization. So yeah, it's a very complex question in the context with regards to relative deprivation and well, there's no easy answer, obviously. Unfortunately, we have to stop our discussion at this point because we've reached the end of our webinar. I would like to thank Thomas for joining us from Chicago and giving us his insightful analysis of the events in Washington. And also thank you very much to Marc for being the discussant today. And thanks for everyone for joining in and all the great questions you have posted. Indeed, we had a fruitful discussion. And I wish you all a nice day in the US and a nice evening in Germany, and see you next time. Goodbye.